I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson at Newswise. It's that time of the year again for back to school nights and PTA meetings. As our children head back into the classroom, national politics and education policy are in the spotlight. Families everywhere are faced with a dilemma over smartphones and social media, bringing some uncomfortable topics into the conversation. How should parents, students, and teachers work together to navigate these touchy subjects? For this episode, you'll hear from our panel of education experts, all faculty at Binghamton University, for a discussion of the classroom controversies looming over the 2024-2025 school year. Newswise COO Tom Canalicchio moderates the discussion.
Today we have 3 faculty members from Binghamton University to discuss issues related to back to school and controversies in America's classrooms. To begin, I would like to start off with Lightning J and ask you, Lightning, if you could introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about these phone bans. What do you think is the benefit of this policy and what challenges might teachers face for that?
My name's Lightning J. I'm an assistant professor here at Binghamton University in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Leadership. So how do phones affect learning? Generally speaking, they harm learning. Phones are generally bad for learning. The most important resource within a classroom is attention. What we know about attention is when you are not focused, you will not retain information. When you are not focused, you will not build new skill sets. And phones are well designed to suck attention. There have been studies that have been done that had people take a test under 3 different conditions. The first condition, they had their phones face down on the desk in front of them. The second condition, they had the phone in their pocket. And the third condition, they had their phone out of the room entirely. And what we found, or what was found, was that the people who had the phone entirely out of the room performed markedly better than people who had their phones accessible, even if the information was not visible. So just having phones around our young people harms their capacity to learn. Well, for teachers, their attention is valuable too. Teachers also have finite attention spans. And when teachers are paying attention to whether a student is averting their eyes or whether they're looking on their phone, when a teacher's cognitive load is focused on how long has that student been in the bathroom, and are they actually in the bathroom or are they on their phone in a place that's hard to see, that teacher is less able to focus on teaching and learning. So our phones are not only making learning worse, phones in the classroom actually make teaching worse. So the final thing that I think those things we know are not good. What I think we don't yet know is the third piece, which is how are phones affecting the school community. When school phone bans work, it tends to be done by the school, by the administration taking the responsibility for, we're going to make sure that students' phones are not present in class. You focus on teaching, teachers. And the other element of this is families. Families are often the ones giving children phones. Families are often chatting, emailing, texting students during class. Families want connectivity with their students. And so I think that's to me where there's a tricky space, is where schools have to figure out how to honor parents' desire to be connected with and communicate with their students. And students, may have to go pick up their little sister, or students may have legitimate needs that we need to find other solutions for. For a long time, the standard was if you needed to talk to your student, you would call the main office. Personally, I'm not sure why that standard isn't something we can return back to. But that's something that requires consensus building. We can't just assume families are ready to make that move. And also, we're dealing with families and students who have now been acculturated into having a phone. So if we just take their phones away, we can't assume that things kind of snap back to the pre-phone times. We have to assume that students are now used to communicating with each other over Snapchat rather than over a lunchroom table. So schools have an obligation to do some rebuilding work around social skills, around what does it look like to get attention, to be connected. in the absence of phones. So it's not just, I think the phone bans are an important step for teaching and learning, but when we think about the importance of community, how do we bring families in? How do we make schools an environment that's welcoming and safe? How do we actually relearn the work of being together? I think that the phone bans can only be considered a start to a much larger mission and a much larger piece of work.
Next, we'll go to Sue. And Sue, if you could please introduce yourself and your job title and tell us about chronic absenteeism. How is this affecting students' achievement, and what can schools do about it?
Thank you. Suzanne McLeod. I am the coordinator of educational leadership here at Binghamton University in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Leadership. The research on chronic absenteeism basically shows three major deficits. The first is that, yes, it does affect your academic achievement. And that, is pretty logical. If you're not there, you're not going to learn your math. If you're not there, you're not going to learn to read. If you're not there, you're not going to be prepared for your standardized assessments or your Regents exams here in New York State. Secondly, there is a pretty direct correlation between chronic absenteeism and later high school dropout rates. You look at children's attendance as early elementary students, that's a pretty strong predictor to will they finish. And then the third is we are establishing later adult behaviors through habits of attendance at school. If I didn't go to school every day, why do I have to go to work every day? Why do I have, to meet my obligations, whether it be college, career, or the military post high school? So this is an area where all of the school districts that I work with are now focusing on that. If it's not one of their top goals for the year to reduce chronic absenteeism, it is absolutely in the top 5.
Okay, thank you, Sue. We'll go next to Kathleen, and if you could introduce yourself and your job title and tell us about the community school model and how this can improve the collaboration between teachers and parents to create better outcomes for the students.
My name is Kathleen Provenzano. I'm an associate professor of community schools in the College of Community and Public Affairs at Binghamton University. So I think in the same way that community schools were kind of better positioned to help students and families and educators overcome many of the challenges that were associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, they're well poised to kind of help educators and families overcome some of the topics that we're discussing on this call. So just, I guess, briefly to give a little bit of context about community schools, when you think about the community school strategy, think of it in terms of an approach to public schooling that transforms a school into a place where educators, local community members, families, students are really working together and collaboratively toward the primary goal of strengthening conditions for student learning, right? They're focused around healthy development for students. So collaboratively, all of these interested parties, they organize these in and out of school resources and supports so that young people in all communities have access to equitable learning opportunities. And the collaboration is fostered through building strong and trusting relationships, inclusive decision making where family members and community members have a seat at the table. It's shifting to a more community-centric approach to education, right? And the strategy is about promoting authentic connections between education and local context. So in the places where I've been able to do some work, this looks like educators and school leadership teams who often are not living in the communities in which they're serving, engaging with community members outside of the school setting. So community events, being mindful about having a presence within communities that they are serving, getting to know community-based organizations, all of the strengths and assets that local neighborhoods have to offer. It's about community school directors and teachers. For example, meeting new kindergarten students and families in their homes or in their neighborhoods before the first day of school starts so that relationships and expectations can start to get established amongst all parties. And this is really how you kind of create a supportive network where students are better poised to perform academically because stronger connections have been made between the home, the school, and the local community in which they reside. So, um, I think that when you're able to create those relationships, it has an impact on student outcomes in meaningful ways. And it also helps all of these interested parties to work together to overcome some of these specific challenges related to chronic absenteeism, related to policy and, what are we going to do with phones in our community? How can we collaboratively and collectively address these particular issues? So it really is about more inclusive decision making, which I think really better positions community school environments and settings to be able to address some of these controversies and topics discussed.
We'll go back ahead to lightning, kind of the current political hot button issues. There's a lot of debates happening between parents and school boards and teachers and administrators about things like curriculum and how certain subject matter is taught. Uh, what advice would you give to teachers how to deal with this and avoid accusations of wanting to indoctrinate students while still accomplishing an education for them?
So I have a study that's coming out right now that looks at the way that we teach the recent past. So I look at the 1950s to today and look at how that shows up in history curricula around the country. I do this by analyzing the different state standards, instructional standards, and what I find is that most state standards effectively end with the election of Ronald Reagan. A lot has happened since the election of Ronald Reagan. But because of this fear of controversy, because of this fear that they're not being taught, we are actually not requiring that students learn anything about the years since Ronald Reagan. Now, I graduated high school in 2005, which means I graduated high school 35 years after Martin Luther King was killed. Every high school taught about that because they recognized Martin Luther King had an important influence on the country, and you couldn't understand this country if you don't teach it. But it's now 35 years since Reagan's presidency, but we're not teaching that. I don't think you can understand this election if you don't know anything about Ronald Reagan, if you don't know anything about either of the Bush presidencies, if you don't know anything about the first Trump presidency, if you don't know anything about the Obama presidency. Interestingly, Obama does show up in state standards way more than the Bushes or even President Trump. So there is ways in which our standards are not reflective of the past. And we know that when students bring politics into the classroom, it's impactful. We saw there's documented cases of racist comments and discrimination aimed at students of color and students from immigrant backgrounds after the election of President Trump happening within schools. There's certainly been a raft of legislation, which is well documented by PEN America, attempting to muzzle and control what is taught in schools since around 2020, give or take. So we see these things flowing into our school spaces. So what are teachers to do? Well, the teachers need to establish facts, and then they need to give students space to reason. And we don't do that. In most social studies classrooms, there's very little time when students have an opportunity to speak directly to one another. And yet schools are a public institution. They're one of our few times when people actually are in a space consistently with someone who might disagree with them. So it's a huge wasted opportunity for us to not be fostering the skills of dialogue, fostering the skills of civic discourse in our classrooms. We know that the poorer a student is, or the more likely a classroom is to have racially minoritized or immigrant students, the less likely they are to have opportunities to actually talk to each other. The more likely they are to have a lecture-based classroom. So there's inequity even within this. But what I wish we would have is that parents would ask students when they came home, who did you disagree with? What discussion did you have? What points what was your evidence? What was other people's evidence? When they heard, they would hear reports of their teachers of teachers actually engaging students in discourse and in dialogue, because these are consequential decisions that affect students' lives. If you're a high schooler, you started high school with the assumption that your race might matter for where you applied for college, that you could get an abortion if you needed one, and we know high schoolers do get abortions, and that you a business would serve you regardless of your sexual orientation. And in many places, that's not true anymore, and high schoolers have no idea why. So what I'm saying is we do a disservice when we don't introduce facts about this country to students, and we do them a disservice when we don't let them practice talking to each other with a teacher as a moderator who can ensure that the discussion is civil and who can ensure the discussion is fact-based.
Sue, we just heard from Lightning a little bit of what he hopes happens at the home after the student returns from school. So I want to ask you a little bit about some of that home life and parenting that teachers and administrators hope can help to improve students' achievement with modern technology and lots of modern issues happening, things like smartphones, social media. These things are affecting kids' mental health. Their bedtimes are all over the place. What kinds of issues and what sort of welfare in the home would you want to give advice to parents about so that their students can come to school more prepared and ready to achieve?
I would suggest, first of all, be aware of what your school's cell phone policies are and help support your child by following those policies. Don't be the parent who is texting constantly throughout the day. How's your day? How's your day? How's your day? Let your child have a measure of independence. The second thing is be very aware of their social media presence. A big meta analysis was just released by the NIH. And basically, it pretty closely links psychological issues that kids have, eating disorders that kids have, that kind of thing, to social media influences on them. So be aware of those. Now, in terms of getting them out the door to school, two things. First of all, be there all day, every day. Unless, this is what I said to my own children 30, 40 years ago, unless you're bleeding, vomiting, or have a fever over 100, you're going to school. It's 180 days. Let's try to make this the year of as close to perfect attendance as we can get. And then the second thing is there was a wonderful study that came out of UCLA School of Psychology over a decade ago about extracurricular activities. What I loved about this study is the sweet spot for extracurricular activities is 2. If you can get your children involved in 2 activities a year, and it doesn't matter, sports or music or art or dance or belonging to your religious organization's youth group, 2 has a direct impact on student achievement. And when UCLA looked at it more deeply, they saw that, first of all, it separated the kids from the phone, the social media, all of those negative influences, because they were at practice for 2.5 hours or something like that every day. But secondly, through the activity, the kids affiliated to a group and learned social behaviors that they then carried into school. They learned how to take direction, let's say from a coach, that carried into school, and it overwhelmingly improved their achievement. So that's what I would be saying.
Thank you, Sue. Kathleen, in these kinds of community schools that you work with, what's the data show about how this helps the students to achieve and perform in school compared to their peers?
We're seeing some really good results with students who are attending community and school environments. And my colleagues and I at Binghamton University are trying to kind of advance this even a little bit further and look at some of these other constructs that community schools are built upon, like family and community engagement and shared leadership practices and collaborative leadership. And we're working to develop a number of measures so that we can continue to do research in community school settings to see how are these particular constructs having an impact on a number of different student outcomes. So the results really are positive that we're seeing. More work needs to be done in this space, but we're kind of advancing, I think, as a field into that arena and creating the research instruments and validating the research instruments that are necessary to do that work. So it's very promising.
Thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you to Binghamton University.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.